Okay, chapter three, cultural evolution. Interesting chapter. Hope you enjoy it. Yes. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. And if you think about it, of course, you guys live in the desert. I live in the Great Plains. They grow a lot of grain here, corn and soybeans mostly. And where you live, corn and soybeans probably don't grow very well. So our environments are different. I've lived up north, farther north than this, where all they could grow was wheat, and it wasn't the kind of wheat we used to grow in Indiana. It was the kind of wheat that would only grow in the northern plains. It was red brome, is what they called it. It was a winter wheat because it's cold up there. There are no large indigenous mammals on the Hawaiian Islands. Therefore, the Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions. These are the biggest things they have. They have the Hawaiian monk seal, which is pretty tiny, and the goose. The humpback whale, of course, is way out in the ocean, and that's about it. This is the Hama Hama Nuka Nuka Apawa'a. This fish, that's the state fish of Hawaii, as curious as that is. The Kung of the Kalahari live in an environment surrounded by large animals and derive much of their caloric intake by hunting these large animals. The Kung have a strong hunting tradition, where on Hawaii they don't, because hunting geese and hunting seals not quite the same as hunting elephants and hunting antelope. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. According to Gilmore from 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. Places where large game is hunted, like buffalo. Places where risky deep sea fishing is performed. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckies greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by young men engaging in frequent violent drunken melees with knives and clubs. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish because fish are readily available in the shallow lagoons. There is virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes lifestyle. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met with the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. And how in the world did they do it? Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal causes of the Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on the thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor, horses, and of course smallpox decimated the Incans. But it wasn't just smallpox; it was other diseases. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no natural immunity to anything that the Europeans brought over. And I've talked about this before, but one of the reasons the Europeans had so many devastating diseases is because Europeans live with their farm animals. They live with their livestock. They live in the same rooms often, the same building certainly. When I was stationed in Germany, my landlord, we lived in a small farming village, and my landlord lived in a house where his barn was his basement. The basement was in his barn. The barn was in his basement. Actually, it was on the bottom level. It wasn't really the basement. And he lived on the second floor and the third floor. So the kitchen was right over the pig stalls. So when they cooked something or when they dumped out trash, when they didn't eat all their food, they just scraped it off into a hole that went down into the barn, right into the pig trough. So if you think about this, any cold that the humans had, any flu, measles, mumps, chickenpox, any kind of diseases, it would be in their food, and of course, when they didn't eat all their food, it would go down to the pigs in the barn. And likewise, when they ate the pigs, whatever mutated viruses that they had would be spread to the people. So here this is how measles, mumps, and chickenpox, all of these diseases, these viral diseases, came out of Europe to devastate the indigenous populations of the Americas. So if you think about it, where in the world did COVID come from? Well, COVID came from China. Why did it come over here? Well, how did the Chinese get it? Well, they think that it started in the pangolin or the bats, and then it was spread to the humans. So humans came in contact with bats, or humans came in contact with pangolins because they don't eat bats, but they eat pangolins, and then it was spread to the humans. From the humans, it came back to the United States. So the influenza comes over every year. It comes over from China. Okay, so we know that other humans have diseases that we don't have. Every year, influenza is different. COVID, of course, nobody had ever seen it before. Actually, we had seen it before, but not in this virulent a form. And if you've been watching all the variants that have been developing, there was a variant, the Delta variant, developed in India. The Omicron variant developed in South Africa, and of course they tried to isolate it, but they weren't able to do it. And now I just read an article that said 99% of all COVID infections in the United States are Omicron. So we have we've taken vaccines and we've had boosters, but the vaccines and boosters had to do with the diseases that we had before. The Alpha variant, the Chicago variant, the Delta variant. That's what we made our vaccines and boosters to fight. And now we've got the Omicron, which isn't very well controlled by any of the vaccines. But of course, what we have found out is that if you have had the vaccine, then you're less likely to have any problems or be hospitalized by the Omicron, by the COVID Omicron variant. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, cows. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements. The domestication of various animals allowed the people in the Eurasian area to live in close proximity with animals for thousands of years. And this is what I was just talking about. Because of this proximity, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans: measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza. And of course, all those diseases devastated the indigenous populations in the Americas. One of the things that people have talked about is the fact that there were larger cities in Europe than there were in the Americas. And the reality is that's not true. That's obviously not true. Um, uh, Teotihuacan was around Mexico, where Mexico City is today, and it had hundreds of thousands of people. Um, if you've ever been to St. Louis, there's a mound outside of St. Louis that area was settled. I'm trying to think what that area is called. Anyway, it had as many as 30,000 people living in the area. And if we go down to South America, the Maya, some of the Mayan cities had tens of thousands of people. The Inca city of Cuzco had hundreds of thousands of people. So the thought that the cities in Europe and Asia and Africa were larger than the cities in the Americas is probably not very accurate. The difference is that people in the Americas didn't live with their livestock as like they did in Europe. They didn't trade their diseases back and forth. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions, but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. The white clay people of Montana talked of the 600 lodges being reduced to 60 when smallpox first struck. Burial had to take place at trees. There were so many dead that they couldn't bury them where they normally did. They usually buried them up in rock formations, but because there were so many dead all at one time, they had to bury people in trees. China is a large country in Eastern Asia. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat. In the south, where it is warmer and more humid, they grow and eat rice. Because there is a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. And this is a map that shows where the northern portion is and where the southern portion is. Now, this green portion is really kind of interesting because in this portion, they eat both wheat and rice. But in the northern portion, of course, it's too cold and too dry for them to grow rice. So they eat wheat. This is not nearly as populated as this area down here. And down here, of course, it's more humid, it's warmer, it's wetter, and they grow rice down here, and that's their staple. So they're the two different areas of China have different staples. Rice is cultivated in paddies, plots of standing water. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. A wheat farmer does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive. Looking at people from northern and southern China, researchers have discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They saw themselves as part of a network, they were tolerant of nepotism, they engaged in more holistic reasoning, and now I'm going to show you, this is from China, so it's really kind of interesting, showing you the difference between the northern Chinese and the southern Chinese.
亲爱的，要不要来一点？
可是我喝一点点就会很晕嘞。
就来一点点啦。啊！这是我特意为你做的。
哇塞，你好厉害呀，亲爱的！
哎，怎样？怎样？哎
What's your problem?
别打了！
哎，go!
抱歉，
What's your problem? 哎，你们干这个！
好恐怖，我不敢看。
亲爱的，能不能先不要看了这个？
这有什么好怕？抢我包！好讨厌！哇塞，你看这个男的长得很帅，有没有？
最爱你的人是我，你怎么舍得我？许多故事有伤心的理由，这一次我的爱情。
Come on, pussy!
One more.
Sorry. Okay. Kind of interesting. Okay. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Evoked culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biologically encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites. Attractive people are healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. When there is little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate, such as intelligence, kindness, and sense of humor. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned such planting practices by observation. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years, and they are both nomadic cattle herders and eat the same foodstuffs, and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are different. The one on top is a Nuer, and the one on the bottom is a Dinka. Oh, this guy's... I lost it. Wait a second, let me get my arrow back. This guy's a Nuer, and this guy's a Dinka. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle and live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds and rely on the meat. The Dinka maintain tribal relationships with the families they live near. The Nuer maintain kinship based on the male line. The Nuer are a larger and more militaristic tribe. The Nuer maintain costly and flexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. Individual variability exists among members of a species on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates. The traits have a hereditary basis. Fast-running antelope have an advantage in outrunning their predators. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain them. Slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in a time of drought, when the food sources are limited, they're more likely to survive than the fast-running antelope. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from generation to generation. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others. These would be examples of this would be religions such as Christianity, the Muslim religion, Buddhism, Hinduism, and political structures such as democracy or communism or monarchies. Copying error are very common with cultural ideas. Copying errors such as mutations are rare among genes. This is what this is how bathing suits evolved over time. This is 1875, as you can see. It's a lot of clothes, and that's still a lot of clothes. This is 1900, not quite as much clothes. And 1925, after the end of the Roaring Twenties, of course, we lost all the excess amount of clothes. 1925, 1927. Genes pass very slowly. Genes pass vertically from parent to offspring. Culture passes horizontally from one person to anyone they come in contact with. Cultural evolution can be very rapid. While genes have to be adaptive to be repeated, cultural ideas do not have to be adaptive. Even maladaptive ideas can spread, as with the headhunters of New Guinea, when half of them died due to a degenerative disease passed from their diseased victims. They were eating the brains of their victims, and their victims had Jacob Creutzfeldt disease, which is the human form of mad cow disease. Dynamic social impact theory posits that individuals come to influence each other, and they do so primarily in terms of how often the individuals interact, which ultimately leads to clusters of like-minded people who are separated by geography, cultures in other words. Norms develop among those who communicate with each other regularly. In 2007, Cullum and Harton followed a group of students for a year. The researchers set a baseline by discovering the students' attitudes before they became students. The researchers discovered that the students that lived in the same dorms and ate in the same dining halls maintained similar attitudes no matter what attitudes they had before coming to school. The students began building microcultures within their living units. Cultures emerge when people communicate. And that's what happened to me when I went away to college. When I was in high school, I was a Republican and I was fairly conservative. But then I went away to college and I lived in a dormitory with all of the African American students that went to the college. My views became far more liberal, and because of the situation, I became a fighter for civil rights. And then, of course, this is in the late 60s into the early 70s. So if I hadn't lived in that dormitory, if I had lived in a fraternity, for example, where they were segregated, so there were no African Americans, my attitude would probably be very, very much different. Contemporary legends are simply fictional stories that are told in modern societies as if they are true. Booby-trapped Halloween candy is one such contemporary legend. There have only been 80 documented cases since 1959, but we talk about them every Halloween. Colonies of released alligators live in the sewers of New York City. New York is too cold for alligators to survive in the winter. The sewers are full of toxic waste that would not support reptilian life. So the probability of there being colonies of alligators in New York City is impossible. HIV-infected needles are being left in coin return slots to contaminate an unsuspecting person. There has never been a recorded case of anyone contracting HIV from being stuck by a needle in a coin return slot. And of course, nobody uses payphones anymore anyway. Researchers have found that rumors and legends are more likely to spread when they can evoke shared emotional reaction among people. The characters from fiction that are the most memorable are the ones that evoke emotion in us, such as Robin Hood. Emotional ideas are more likely to spread through a culture than are unemotional ones. This is why our news is full of sensational stories of rescues, disasters, and wrecks, rather than the mundane things that happen every day. And this is a picture of an earthquake in Italy. The Fulani of Africa believe that the world was created from a drop of milk. Japanese mythology states that the world was created from brine dripping from the tip of the jewel spear of heaven. Judeo-Christian beliefs state that God created heavens and earth in 6 days. The kinds of stories that are especially likely to persist in our memories are ones that contain a few minimally counterintuitive ideas. Minimally counterintuitive means that they are statements that are surprising and unusual in the sense that they violate our expectations that are not too outlandish, such as this boat that is shaped like a guitar. Does globalization mean that we are destined to all become citizens of a homogeneous world culture? And the answer is probably not. The trend toward globalization is simultaneously paralleled by an opposing trend toward increasing tribalism. And that's so the two go against each other. It's a little bit easier for me to see globalization because I've lived all over the world. There is not a place that is mine. Iowa is becoming that kind of a place for me. But I was born in Indiana and I moved all over. I've lived in 17 different states and 3 different countries. So it's easier. And the interesting thing is that when I moved to a new place, and we haven't actually moved since last time we moved here in 2011. Whenever I move to a new place, I'm always looking for national news and international news, but local news doesn't really interest me. So while I was living in Oklahoma, I read the Daily Oklahoman, which is a Oklahoma-wide newspaper. I used to read the Daily Oklahoman, but I didn't read the Daily Oklahoman for the local news. I was reading it for the news of the United States and news from around the world. One of the things I missed when we were stationed in Germany was information about what the hell was going on in the United States. Because the only magazines that they would send me, at the time I would get Newsweek magazine, but the only one they would send me was the International Newsweek magazine, which is completely different from the one that people get in the United States. So it was so I wasn't getting a lot of really good information. I hadn't been away from Indiana that long. I'd really like to know what was going on in Indiana. Very almost impossible to get that information from anyone except my parents. Ethnically diverse cities such as New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney are microcosms of the world at large in many ways. Each has many distinct ethnic enclaves coexisting within their boundaries. Thus, there are trends toward cultural heterogeneity globally, while there is a trend toward cultural homogeneity at the local level. Cultures that are individualistic include a variety of practices and customs that encourage individuals to place their own personal goals ahead of those of the collective and to consider how they are distinct from others. And this is information that was discovered by Trandis in 1989. Now, if you think about it, 1989 was what, 22 and 11, 33 years ago. So is this still true? One of the things that Trandis didn't understand was the internet, because there was no internet in 1989. The internet wasn't invented and didn't become national and global until 1993. So Trandis didn't have any clue about what would be happening in 33 years. Tracking of children, unique practices in individualistic cultures, tracking of children at school, workers being given meritocratic pay at the office, college-age children being encouraged to move out of their parents' homes. And this is what happened with my family. As I've told you before, I was number 4. And as my older sister graduated from high school, the expectation was for her to go away to college. When my brother graduated from high school, he went away to college. When my youngest sister graduated from college, she moved away, but she didn't go to college. She went to stewardess school. And then, of course, when I graduated from high school, I went away to college as well. Now, the truth is that my oldest sister and my oldest brother didn't move out of the state. They just moved across the state. And actually, my sister moved to Ball State, which was only like 10 miles down the road. But she moved into a dormitory. She didn't live at home. And my brother, of course, went to Purdue, which is across the state, and I went to Wabash, which is across the state as well. So most of us moved out of the house, and that was the expectation. But there were 6 of us in the house. So as we moved out, it became less crowded, I guess, and that wasn't too bad. Employees being given individual cubicles, that's what happens in individualistic cultures. People choosing to put their elderly relatives in retirement home, individualistic cultures. In collectivistic cultures, collectivistic cultures include many cultural practices, institutions, and customs that encourage individuals to place more emphasis on collective goals, the goals of one's in-group. Children sleeping with their parents is common in collectivistic cultures. Classes of school children being promoted together to the next grade regardless of the performance of some individual's children. Marriages being arranged by parents in collectivistic cultures. Companies compensating their employees on the basis of how long they have been employed. Extended families living under one roof. Many surveys reveal that Americans feel more financially pressed than before, even though real incomes have been rising and time pressures have increased as 2-career families have become common. Putnam in 2000 speculates that individualism has increased by 10% in the United States. And of course, we're seeing more of this with the pandemic. Suburbanization is another reason for increased individualism in the United States, according to Putnam, and this factor is also at 10%. One of the interesting things that has happened with the pandemic because more people are working at home. They realize that they don't like where they live. Before they were living as close to their work as they possibly could, so their commute wouldn't be very long. And now people are selecting or are choosing to move away from where they are to some place that is more wholesome. Suburbanization results in the people spending more time in their cars and in their homes and less time with friends and neighbors. And of course, now with more people working online, this isn't. They're having more interaction with their neighbors and with their friends, and they're spending no time at all in their cars. So they realize that they need a house that they really like. They need a home that they really like, and so the house prices, the prices for real estate, have really skyrocketed since the pandemic started. The second largest culprit to increased individualism among Americans at 25% is electronic entertainment, especially television, which leads people to isolate themselves and engage in more passive forms of entertainment. And of course, you can add, you don't have to even think about television, you can talk about video games and social media. Next fall, I'm going to teach a class in social media. And the reason I'm going to do that is because there are some really negative things that have happened because people have become obsessed with social media, with video games. And we need to talk about, as psychologists, we need to talk about whether this is a good trend or a bad trend, whether this is something that's going to evolve. You know, all of these things evolve so that their impact isn't nearly as severe. Is that what's going to happen with social media and with the gaming? So I'm going to teach a class in that. I haven't put it together yet. I'll probably do that over the summer. I'm looking forward to it. But this semester I'm pretty busy, so but it should be fun. I know I'm an old fart and I don't understand any of this stuff. I don't keep my telephone with me constantly, looking to see if somebody's trying to communicate with me. As a matter of fact, my ringer wasn't working, and I didn't realize it because I don't have my phone with me. I don't keep it on me, and you guys do, and I understand. You know, your habits are completely different from mine because when I was growing up, telephones were attached to the wall. You couldn't carry them around. That would be silly. The best you could do was have a long cord and go someplace and close the door and still be able to talk on the phone. Now, of course, we carry them around with us. So that's all changed everything. Putnam in 2000 discovered that the younger generation even watch TV differently from the way their parents and grandparents do, as they are more likely to turn the TV on even if there is nothing in particular that they have in mind to watch. The older generations are more likely to watch TV only when there is a particular show that they want to see, and that's the way it works. Another difference today that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago is that people are binge watching things. Netflix and some of the other, I guess there's Disney Plus and there's other IMBD and whatnot. Those allow you to watch the same television show that you missed, 2 or 3 years ago. Now you can catch up. You can binge watch them. You can just watch that show, and that's of course something that you were never able to do before. My son, my son fell in love with The Simpsons when they first came out, and so he started recording all of the Simpson episodes. And now, of course, you can just go to somewhere on television, somewhere on cable, and watch all the Simpsons. But he had them all on tape. I don't even know if he has a VCR anymore. But he did that because he was so enamored with the Simpsons. He was an actor. One of the things he has done in his life is he tried to become an actor. So he was studying these things. He was studying television shows and he was studying actors and whatnot. So he would fall in love with different television shows. One of the television, The Office. He loved The Office, so he had all of those television shows. What was it? Parks and Recreation was another. It Never Rains in Philadelphia was another. Anyway, so he became obsessed with the various television shows. Now, I'll have to admit, when I started watching The Big Bang Theory, I was behind. I was 3 or 4 years behind, so I bought the old episodes on CD, and I used to watch. I watched all the old episodes so that I would come up I would be up to date with what was going on. Approximately half of the variance behind the increasing individualism rests with the different lifestyles between the younger and the older generation. So this is really kind of interesting because my son just started a new job and he's 50 years old. My son is 50 years old. And the other people being hired with him are in their 20s. And he says their work ethic is completely different from his because he's not a millennial, because he is the person that he is. He's looking for work. He's trying to get, he wants to be able to be functional as quickly as possible. And a lot of these individuals, a lot of the 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds, they're just kind of hanging out and hiding from learning all of these things. They're getting the same amount of money, but they don't quite have the same work ethic that he does. One of the most remarkable findings regarding cultural change is that people seem to be getting smarter. On average, across all cultures for which there is longitudinal data, people in the current generation have higher IQ scores than those from earlier generations. And this is a little frustrating for me because I was I have a relatively high IQ, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore because everybody has the same IQ that I had. But 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, my IQ was thought to be quite different, quite impressive, not so impressive anymore. The trend of intelligence rising has been dubbed the Flynn effect after the researcher who first identified it, and that was Flynn in 1987 and 1994. A review of changes in IQ scores in 14 nations revealed that the average increase in IQ was between 5 and 25 points per generation. That's a lot. 25 points is quite a bit. If the average intelligence is 100, IQ of 100, 5 to 25 points is 105 to 125 in just one generation. According to Healy in 1990, most television programming communicates at about a 4th grade vocabulary level, which is really kind of interesting if you think about it, because one of the reasons that people liked the Big Bang Theory was because it was so intellectual, and they used real science. They were talking about real science. And so a lot of people enjoyed watching it just to hear what they were saying. So very much different from other television shows that communicate at the fourth grade vocabulary level. One of the ways that you learn new vocabulary is by taking it in. One way to take in new vocabulary, of course, is to read. Another is to watch shows on television. I just read something the other day. I was reading a book and I came across a term, semiotics, and they were talking about studying semiotics. And now I have to look it up because I don't remember what it means. The study of signs and symbols and the use of use or interpretation of symbols. That's semiotics. So they were talking about semiotics, and they were talking about the philosophy of semiotics, which was pretty boring. But the reality was that was a word I'd never heard before. I'd never even seen that word before. So here we are. Now you guys know it, and potentially I'll remember it. I remembered the word anyway. I just didn't remember the definition. But that's how you learn new words is by reading them or hearing them on television, potentially. And this is one of the reasons why the internet is not a bad thing, certainly not a bad thing, is because you can find things out right away. I was able to look up semiotics in a nanosecond fairly quickly. Of men born in 1890, only 27% had more than an eighth grade education, and only 9% had any schooling after high school. My father was born in 1918. His oldest brother was born in 1900. Um, his father, of course, was born in the 1870s. And one of the things that his father believed in was that you didn't need that much education. So when his children graduated from middle school, when they graduated from the ninth grade or the eighth grade, and would have moved on to high school, he said, no, you don't need that education. If you're intelligent, then you don't need it. So when my father, who was the youngest in the family, when my father came along and he graduated from the eighth grade and said, I want to go to high school, my grandfather said, no, you can't go to high school. Um, you can't go to high school because you don't need that much education. And my father said, but I still want to go. And he said, well, if you want to go to high school, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to pay me room and board because I'm not going to be responsible for you going to high school. Now, unfortunately, of course, this is my dad was born in 1918. So when he was, what, 14 years old, going into high school, yeah, 14 years old. That was 1932, and that was in the depths of the Depression. So what my grandfather wanted him to do was go to work, but he didn't. Well, he did. He had to pay him room and board in order to go to high school. So my dad got a job at a grocery store, and he was able to keep the family afloat, keep the family fed by bringing home expired food or food that was partially rotten. And usually, what happened if it got slimy on the outside, like a head of cabbage, if it got slimy on the outside, they'd peel off all the bad stuff, go to the heart of it, and they could still eat the heart because it hadn't started rotting yet. So he got all that food, or if the can was damaged and nobody would buy it, then he would get that can. So my father was able to go make it all the way through high school, but at one point he wasn't making enough money, and his brother paid his room and board to his father, as weird as that may sound. In 2012, the percentage of Americans over 25 who had more than an eighth grade education was approximately 94%. 58% had some schooling after high school, and approximately 11% had graduate degrees. That was in 2012. Now, the interesting thing is in 2012 was the year that I finished my PhD. So I was awarded my PhD in February of 2012, when 11% of the population had graduate degrees that year. Throughout the 20th century, until the last couple of decades, people were able to get by with as little as an eighth grade education. We lived in Muncie, Indiana. Muncie, Indiana is a factory town. And a lot of the individuals didn't have high school educations where I was. In the 21st century, it takes some college to get by, and there's an ever-growing proportion obtaining graduate degrees. This is an old picture from the 1920s, 1930s. As you can see, they're building motors. These are engines. As you can see, these are motors. That potentially is in my hometown because in Muncie had a Chevrolet plant. They also built batteries, Delco battery. What else did they have there? They built transmissions. Warner Gear was in Muncie. It's not in there. It's not there anymore. I'm not sure where it is anymore. But Warner Gear was in Muncie. Societies are always looking for scapegoats to explain problems that they don't understand. In Europe, a frequent scapegoat has been alien religions, especially Judaism. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe, killing people. Looking for someone to blame, Europeans began blaming the Jews for poisoning their wells. These beliefs led to pogroms in most European countries, including Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. And this is a pogrom in the 1940s in the Ukraine. And as you can see, they've torn her clothes away, and she's just wearing her underwear, and she's being chased through the streets, being beaten by young boys. This one's got a stick, and she's got a bloody nose. If you can see the picture better, the pogroms erupted periodically into the 20th century, and of course, this is one caused by Nazism, by fascism. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based in part, on the platform of blaming all Germany's problems on the Jewish population. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. So these extreme ideas followed for over 600 years into the 20th century. These extreme ideas. So the areas that had extreme ideas in the 14th century continued to have these extreme ideas into the 1920s and 1930s. Because cultures evolve from their past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one of the important reasons that cultural differences can persist across time. Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. The Pilgrims were a form of Puritanism. The Puritans that we talk about are the Pilgrims that we talk about during Thanksgiving. They were a form of Puritan. Puritanism emphasized respect for authority and the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dream of forming a utopia would emerge only from an educated population. Philadelphia was settled by Protestant Quakers. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with the utilitarian curriculum, with medical, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community or financial support from the Quaker culture, as it had little trust in higher education. Now, strangely enough, my family came over to the New World as Quakers. Well, my father's family did. They were Quakers. My mother's side of the family were a different denomination of Christianity. They were Baptists. The Puritans built Harvard University using a liberal arts curriculum that emphasized community service. The university received tremendous community and financial support and is today the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States at $32.9 billion. $32.9 billion. The number of political leaders coming out of Harvard has been strong from its founding until today. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism, Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. Philadelphia's culture has remained distrustful of authority and hard to govern, yet tolerant of diversity. And of course, Will Smith is from Philadelphia. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by the Puritans and Quakers, respectively. Hence, the cities have been able to maintain the cultural traditions of their forebears. Philadelphia is far more tolerant, and Boston is far less tolerant, but it is authority is very powerful there. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what people tell us or our observations of how they behave. Pluralistic ignorance is the tendency for people to collectively misinterpret the thoughts that underlie other people's behavior. All these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. As you can see, everybody has the same idea. A good example of pluralistic ignorance was divulged in the studies done looking at the German people after World War II by Hannah Arendt in 1964. Arendt determined that Nazism was not followed, but because the German people were evil, it was followed because they were thoughtless and conforming. And of course, as you can see, everybody's giving the Nazi salute, except this guy right here. That's the fascist salute, actually. So try not to do that, except that guy, and he's got his arms crossed. And if you can find anybody else that doesn't have their arm up, everybody does. They've all got their arms up. Thoughtless and conforming, and that's kind of what seems to be going on in the United States from time to time. We just seem to follow really bad ideas, and they just keep multiplying. And that is the end of the chapter. Really fascinating chapter. So I'll see you guys next week.